The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Brittany Patel with Next Generation. In this month's session, we're happy to introduce Brian Boyle, who's the Director of Business Development for ADLP Investments. And if you registered for this webinar, you know that today's topic is focused around consumer debt buying. We're going to talk about the industry in general, some market trends, and then we'll talk about how this applies when you're using a self-directed IRA as well. Just a couple quick housekeeping items before we jump in. The broadcast is being recorded, so if you registered, whether or not you're attending live with us today, you will receive an email within the next day or so containing a recording that you can access on demand. And if you do have any questions, please enter them into the question box on the right side panel of your screen. We are going to try to save about 10 to 15 minutes toward the end of this to address any questions that you have. So with that, I'm going to let Brian jump into it, and we're excited to provide some valuable education here today.
Hey everybody, again, my name is Brian Boyle. I am the Director of Business Development with ADLP Investments, and today we're going to discuss consumer debt buying, an innovative addition to your alternative investment portfolio. A little bit about ADLP Investments. So our team formerly worked at a multi-state law firm. We had more or less built legal collections programs for some of the larger banks and debt buyers in the country. They utilized our law firm to handle vast portfolios of consumer debt. And once placed with our law firm, we basically managed the data and built processes for them to help liquidate some delinquent debt pools of theirs. And not only did we work with big banks, but we also worked with publicly traded debt buyers. And it was at this point that we realized how lucrative consumer debt buying could be if done in a compliant, organized fashion. So with that being said, and I clicked on this slide a little bit early, we're going to start with just informing you folks about how debt buying began, because although we're very comfortable with the process, we've realized that consumer debt buying is not something that is known as a mainstream investment to the investor population. So with that being said, how did debt buying begin? Well, in the early 20th century, the US government wanted to encourage people to buy homes. And for that reason, Congress passed the Federal Home Loan Bank Act. And what this did was it chartered savings and loan associations called S&Ls, which allowed members, specifically working class people, to pool their money together and finance mortgages. You know, from the mid 1980s to the mid 1990s. Apologize for that should say mid 1990s. There was nearly a third of S&Ls became insolvent, and really what that means is that they had no money, and a lot of them were struggling to continue to function. So the Federal Deposit Insurance, the FDIC, which insured deposits up to a certain amount, received distressed assets from these S&Ls, which were called non-performing loans. And the FDIC then at that point realized that it had vast inventories of these distressed assets, and they wanted to at least recoup some of the money that they had lent out. So what they did is they held these auctions, and participants in these original auctions, known as debt buyers, became pioneers of what would become this burgeoning debt buying industry. Essentially, the FDIC would auction off tens of millions of dollars of these distressed delinquent loans, and the debt buyers would buy them for pennies on the dollar. Today, it's become a huge industry. Big banks have duplicated the model, and they use it for a couple of reasons. But one of which is to really keep up with capital requirements, and also just to streamline some of their delinquent loan collections processes. Because a lot of what these big banks do, they're not collectors. They have all of these large portfolios, but it's not their forte in terms of being able to continuously collect on delinquent consumers. So with that being said, the name of our game really is to steer clear of these big banks. They also, they conduct these sales, but what we like to do is work with more smaller institutions like credit unions and auto finance companies, because the big banks, they have more resources, they have more personnel and data that we ever will, but that's okay, because there's plenty of opportunity for mid-level companies to conduct their own sales and also to capitalize on infrastructure that makes the most out of liquidating debt pools. So moving on to slide 3, we just want to introduce you to some of the industries with the most consumer debt. First, there's mortgages. We don't typically deal with mortgages, but I wanted to at least put it up there. I think investment banks and publicly traded hedge funds deal with mortgages a little bit more. But again, as we mentioned, our approach is to steer clear of these large investment institutions. And again, we'll never be them, but that's all right. So moving down to auto loans, this is a specialty of ours. In just looking at some of the data here, in September 2017, there's 2 million auto loans originated, resulting in close to 50 billion in new loans. And then there's also credit card debt, which we look at as well. And as this says, the average household in the U.S. has approximately $15,000 in credit card debt. In September 2017, 7 million credit cards originated with an aggregate credit limit of close to $30 billion. Moving on. So, what percentage of outstanding debt has entered the delinquent collections phase? And this chart is meant to show you that it's a huge industry. 30 million people in the U.S. have at least one debt in collection. So, there are plenty of opportunities out there for debt buyers. It's not something that the market is shrinking or there's no opportunities to buy. And just bringing you down some of these numbers, we had mentioned that 75% of the debt buying is done by the large banks. But still, I mean, if you look at student loans, credit cards, auto loans, specifically the credit cards and auto loans, if you take that 2.3 billion and you take 25% of that, you're still left with $575 million worth of delinquent paper out there. And then if you throw the auto loans on top of the credit card loans, you take the 1.7 billion and you times that by 25%. That's another $425 million. So, we're dealing with close to $1 billion worth of paper, and this is a market that recycles. It's not just $1 billion and all of a sudden it's going to go down to zero. With each year, more and more people are paying off their debts, but also accruing debt. So it's something that recycles back and forth, and can more or less create continuous opportunity for debt buyers. So next, we just want to talk about how does large-scale debt buying work. Again, you have the big banks and nationwide auto finance companies that, whether it's quarterly or yearly, they'll review their books and they'll have pools and portfolios of loans that consumers are late on their payments or they've just stopped paying altogether. So what happens is, whether it's quarterly or annually, they'll conduct these sales, and the big banks will typically work with some of the larger publicly traded debt buyers. Few are listed here, and these are companies that we had actually done work with directly when we were at our national law firm. So companies like Resurgent or PRA Group or Encore, these are companies that you can look up online. They have a ticker on the bottom of the screen. If you're looking at financial television shows or anything of that nature. So these big banks and nationwide auto companies will sell these publicly traded debt buyers for, prices can vary, but they usually end up being anywhere from 5 to 7 cents on the dollar. And these debt buyers, their goal is to recover more than that 7 cents. So what they do is they take in the data and they have a nationwide assembly of law firms and agencies that they work with to try and liquidate some of this paper. And when we say liquidate, we mean, collection agencies will send some letters, they'll make follow-up calls with consumers, but then also on the other side, you have law firms that are looking to, serve folks with letters saying, you owe this money, you're subject to some legal liability if you don't pay this, and, we will bring you to court and also eventually look to garnish wages or freeze bank accounts, et cetera. And what we found is people are getting phone calls or letters from a collection agency, it's more of just a, hey, yeah, no, that's fine, whatever, and then they tend to ignore it, especially since a lot of these letters are going through snail mail, and many people now, they neglect their snail mail. Additionally, there's landlines being called where most people are just picking up their cell phone these days. So there's a lot of weaknesses in that collection agency model. Whereas with the law firm, when you're getting a legal a letter in the mail, a legal letterhead, it tends to generate a bit more attention from the consumer. So this is how it works, and happy to answer any questions at the end of the presentation. But let's talk about what we do now, because a lot of what we do is like this, but we just focus on smaller banks, credit unions, and auto finance companies. So for us, these are some of the companies that we work with. So if you have a Ford Motor Credit, you have smaller versions of that throughout the country. Whether you have these smaller credit unions that offer auto loans, or these independent auto finance companies that write loans to folks as well. And what we do is we take the place at ADLP, we take the place of some of these larger debt buyers, because their hands are tied. They're working with the Chases of the world. They're working with the Wells Fargos of the world, and buying these hundreds of millions of dollars portfolios. And with us, we realize that if we can aggregate a bunch of credit unions and independent auto finance companies, our buying potential is going to rival that of a Chase. It's actually something called the long tail theory, where if you aggregate a bunch of smaller sellers, your opportunity can be equal to and perhaps exceed some of the levels of paper that are being sold. So this is what we do. We focus on the smaller players. The challenge here is that it's hard to develop relationships with these smaller players. It takes time. It takes years to go in there, be comfortable with their back office, help them through any documentation issues or any compliance issues that they've had, and really make the process organized and clean for us. So we've over time been able to develop relationships with companies like this, and they do exactly what the big banks do. Every quarter, every year, they will call up a company like ADLP, and they will be able to say, okay, look, we have X amount in delinquent loans for this year. Let's do a sale. And at that point, the data and documents are exchanged, and a debt buyer, a mid-sized debt buyer like ADLP, will take in that data, and you can utilize your own network of agencies and law firms, just like the big boys do. What we found is, just like the smaller players from the sell side, our attorneys tend to be local shops that typically only work in 1 to 2 states, and that's very helpful for a company like ours. We want to keep our buying limited. We don't want to buy national debt pools like some of these other players do, where a Chase is saying to an Encore, hey, here's our debt pool. This consists of consumers in all 50 states. With us, you really want to keep your buying specific to 5 or 6 states where you have good attorney relationships, and you're very comfortable with the laws. And if you can do that, there's a ton of opportunity to be had. So moving on, why isn't mid-sized debt buying more prevalent? There are a ton of barriers to entry. Simple as that. As I mentioned before, access to buying opportunities, creating these opportunities with these credit unions, with these auto finance companies, it takes a while. A lot of the times when you're starting to work with a company like that, they're doing this for the first time. So they're hesitant, and you have to meet with them. You have to prove to them that you're compliant, that you're professional, that you have the experience necessary, able to make this a seamless process for them. Secondly, analytical tools and experience to adequately price debt pools. You have to be really keyed in, and you have to be knowledgeable about what consumer base you're buying, whether or not it's access to employment information, address information, certain key indicators like age or specific states that you want to buy in. This is really complicated stuff to the outsider. Fourthly, just having a reliable, efficient network of agencies and attorneys is really important, and very difficult to do for a newcomer to the industry. The collection agencies and attorneys, they work on a contingency basis. So in the beginning, it's interesting. The client-servicer relationship is almost flipped because you have to prove to them that you're a good client, that your investments are going to be generating recoveries, and their contingency is going to increase over the long run and would be a profitable project for them. And developing that relationship, especially when it comes down to consumer debt buying, a vertical where revenue takes about 6 to 8 months to start coming in, there has to be that trust there, and that's a tough thing to build. And we've been able to do that because we worked at a firm before, and we had a significant amount of contacts in the industry. The know-how and the systems for debt pool management, again, I mean, big technology hasn't really entered this space yet. So a lot of your debt pool management is done on proprietary systems that take it takes a lot of knowledge, a lot of know-how, and building it can be very expensive. Next, the knowledge about what states to buy consumer debt in and state-level requirements for collections. Some states have very debtor-friendly rules. For example, Texas, there are no wage guard opportunities there, which greatly limits your ability to recover on pools. Some states like Florida and California, their turnaround times in the courts are extremely long. So again, that affects your turnaround times, your revenue projections, and the like. And knowing these things and knowing how to steer clear of these territories is it's something you just get from experience. And next, just establish relationships with asset data vendors. I think this is a burgeoning field. Being able to find information about where people work and address information is good, but it takes a while. You have to go through a vetting process with these companies to make sure they want to make sure you're compliant and you're exchanging data at the end of the day. So these are things that take a while. And lastly, just strict compliance with regulations. And I won't bore you with all the acronyms, but it should just show you that there's a lot that you have to deal with, and that's very important. And it only comes with years of experience, and preferably working at a law firm and doing this on a large scale for large companies. So why are delinquent credit card and subprime auto loans a worthwhile alternative investment? So this is very important, and these are all high-level numbers, but definitely worthwhile to go through. When you're buying something, when you're buying a pool, you have very distinct targets that you're trying to hit, right? So you're looking at, hey, look, when you buy something for 3 or 4 cents on the dollar, if you liquidate 10 to 15% of that portfolio, and what that means is, hey, you buy this for 3 or 4 cents on the dollar, but you get 10 or 15 cents in return, that's triple the returns. And it's excuse me, this is something that it could obviously generate a lot of revenue and profit potential for people, because again, you're talking about a scenario where if you're only able to recover 15% of the pool, you're still tripling, perhaps quadrupling your initial investment, and that's with 85% of the pool not even generating any return. So again, you shouldn't even. We've seen pools liquidate at 20 to 30%. So if you can overcome those initial boundaries that we had went through in the previous slide, there's certainly some opportunity there. The second main bullet is time is on your side. When you're buying loans, people that have fallen behind on a loan or stopped paying a loan, it's really because at that point they can't pay. But many folks, they have their financial circumstances change over time, and once you're awarded a judgment through an attorney, these judgments, they can last 10 to 20 years. You can renew them constantly, and you can stay in contact with folks that maybe at the time of purchase they weren't in a position to pay, but 5, 10 years down the line they are. And things like wage garnishments, people that have wage garnishments, they have to pay maybe $50 to $100 a month. So these things are very like annuities in the sense where they can carry on for years. So here's the investment, how the investment process works, and I'll go through this very quickly. You'll receive an electronic data for a data pool, then you'll receive the documentation, and then you'll close the purchase. Then what happens is you have all this information, you place it out with collection agencies for 60 to 90 days, and then you place the remaining debt pool with your attorneys. So the attorneys are going to send demand letters, they're going to file claims, and they're going to obtain judgments. very much like I talked about in the previous slide about the importance of obtaining judgments, because these legal documents can really be an obligation to pay for 15 to 20 years. And then from there, the attorneys will search, they'll file garnishments, and successful garnishments will generate a steady flow of income. Why debt buying is an ideal retirement investment. We've spoken about this a little bit more previously. It's steady long-term cash flows. You can reinvest, and there's no correlation with the stock market. Really, these are predictable returns, and whether or not we're in a recession does not have much of an effect on a debt pool investment, which I think is definitely important in these times of uncertainty within the market. So lastly, this is just a simple setup for how you would invest in consumer debt buying with your IRA. You'll fill out an application, then you fund the IRA through the contribution, rollover, or transfer. Then you'll review and accept the investment LLC's general operating agreement. From there, you'll also review the subscription document, and then you work with the IRA custodian. They sign documents on behalf of the IRA, and then from there, the IRA will transfer funds to something called a series within a consumer debt buying entity, per your direction. And then you'll get reporting every month, showing how much money has been returned, and giving you the option to either just recoup that money or reinvest it into other consumer debt buying pools. But with that being said, we have some sample IRA application forms here. The recommended custodian, our starter kit sample, and then investment purchase kit. But again, happy to answer any questions. There's a lot to take in 20 minutes, and hopefully this has been helpful. And with that being said, I'm going to hand it off to Brittany and the next generation folks who will carry on the presentation.
Great. Thanks, Brian. That was awesome. I think you did a good job of handling a lot of information in a short period of time. So we appreciate that. I'm going to get a little bit more into, here was your contact information. I think we forgot that. We'll also follow up with this, right? So if anybody needs it. Okay, great. So we're going to get a little bit more into the concept behind self-directed IRAs. I know that we do have a diverse audience for this webinar, and some people had expressed that they were really interested in the consumer debt buying side of the topic, and then other people really seemed like they might not be familiar with self-directed IRAs, and they wanted a bit of a 101 on how to do this. So I'm going to get into the details on that side of things, and then we'll kind of connect it back at the end as to how that works with this sort of an investment that Brian was talking about today. So next generation, simply as a company, our role as it relates to self-directed IRAs is we're a custodian and administrator for these retirement accounts. So similar to a Fidelity or Schwab, for example, that might hold your retirement plans today, we have a similar role in that we provide all the tax reporting on your account, we do all the record keeping, we process the investment transactions, and we just specialize in holding non-publicly traded alternatives. So just to clarify, unlike some of the other institutions I mentioned, we are not a fiduciary. So we don't provide financial advice or sell specific investment products, because with self-directed IRAs, the investor has the ability to choose their own investments. So there is a bit of responsibility on that investor to do some of their due diligence on these investments. Now, we provide a lot of education around the rules and guidelines that are set forth by the IRS, so that if you are considering something, you are making sure that you're operating within the IRS guidelines. And we do review investments for compliance with those guidelines, but we don't review them for legitimacy or potential investment return. So that's something that you as an investor have to be comfortable with if you're directing us to make an investment on behalf of your IRA. Just a little bit of background on the company real quick. We've been in business for 15 years. It's actually our 15-year anniversary this year. We were just voted one of the best IRA custodians in America for 2019. We're actually number 2. So that was pretty exciting. And as you can see here, we've taken part in a lot of different publications. We've we're a Forbes member of the Finance Council, so we publish some content there. And our founder and CEO started out as a real estate broker who wanted to put real estate investments within our IRA and couldn't find a way to do that. So that's how she came to found this company. And yeah, we continue to provide education in a variety of different ways. We've been on podcasts as well. So the structure of the company is there are two components. I mentioned we're a custodian and an administrator. So these are two sister companies. In order to be a custodian and hold a retirement account, you have to have some sort of qualification. So ours is that we are a trust company, and we have a trust charter in the state of South Dakota, which is just the state that the banking commission that regulates our business activities. But we can hold accounts for investors in any state or even out of the country as long as they have U.S. income and a tax ID number. And then the next generation services component is the customer service side of the business, which is where I am right now, our office in New Jersey. And if you were to interface with anyone regarding a self-directed IRA with Next Generation, you'd be talking to Next Generation Services. So it's just important to understand there are two components. And for those of you who are new to this kind of concept, I think sometimes people get confused about what actually is a self-directed IRA and what makes it different from the 401k or the IRA that you might already have. So from a contribution limit standpoint and the tax implication standpoint, they are just like other IRAs that you might have, but they allow you to open up your investment options. And so you're no longer limited to stocks, bonds, and mutual funds, which is a potential hedge against market volatility. As Brian mentioned earlier, there's been a lot of uncertainty in the market, and individuals are looking to further diversify outside of publicly traded assets. So that gives you, with a self-directed IRA, the ability to get a little bit more creative. And then, of course, if you're already doing these types of investments outside of an IRA, if you're doing them within your retirement plan, you get the tax advantage as well. So anything that you earn on these investments goes directly back into your retirement plan, and those earnings will be tax deferred if you have a tax deferred account, or if you have a Roth, they'll be tax free. So that's obviously a great benefit as well. So why is this important? As you can see here, the percentage of retirement age workers in the labor force is above 20%. It's doubled from a low of 10% back in the early 80s. So we're seeing that a lot more workers are not retiring, even though technically they can, and they're staying in the workforce. Now, we can probably attribute that to a lot of different things, but part of that is, we're seeing, Social Security benefits are being limited for, coming generations, high healthcare costs. Maybe some people had a lot of money saved up, and when the market crashed in 2008, they lost a lot of what they had saved in their accounts, so they're having to continue working so that they can survive. So this is really important when we talk about volatility and the effect that it can have on people's lifestyles. And this is just a testament to that. And then another component is the growth of just alternative assets in general. We're seeing a lot of financial advisors have indicated that they plan on increasing these allocations in their clients' investment portfolios. And you can see that of the asset classes that they were looking at, 82% was coming from private equity, lending, and real estate. So that's obviously huge, and these are all things that can be held in an IRA as well. So the types of plans that you can establish that can be self-directed, these are all of the account types that we can hold here, are the traditional tax-deferred IRA, a Roth IRA for tax-free investing. If you're a business owner, you can open some other types of some plans like the SEP IRA or solo 401k or other qualified plans, which allow you to operate and use that plan just like a business owner would, and they usually allow for higher contribution limits. So you can put away more of your own compensation into those plans. And then also, a lot of people don't realize that Coverdell education savings accounts for children can also be self-directed, as well as health savings accounts with the same tax benefits. So the way to get funds into an IRA, Brian had mentioned this briefly. In order to have a self-directed IRA, you'd fill out an application, you'd establish an account, but then in order to get cash into the account to make your investment, you typically would be moving it from another existing retirement plan that you have, and that's something that we would assist with. Or, of course, you can make a personal contribution, but you do have the option to roll over, and that's typically going to be, when we're talking about rollovers, we're talking about accounts that aren't already IRAs. So if you have an old employer 401k, a pension plan, or a 403b or 457 plan, depending on the institution that you work for, and it's no longer active, most often they're eligible that you can roll those into an IRA, because at that point when you're no longer active, they're just sitting there and they're not doing anything for you. So you can take those funds and put them into a vehicle that's going to allow you to be a little bit more creative and take a little bit more control over your investment returns. And then if you already have an IRA with another institution, typically the large brokerage firms, they won't hold private, non-publicly traded alternatives. So they'll tell you that they can't hold a real estate or private equity investment, but that doesn't mean that you don't have the ability to transfer funds from that account into a self-directed one that will allow you to make these types of investments. So you have a variety of options here depending on the investment you're looking at and the funds that you need to make that investment happen. These are just examples of some things that you can invest in with a self-directed retirement account. So obviously we talked about, purchasing consumer debt, real estate's huge, mortgage notes themselves, limited partnerships, hedge funds, joint ventures. You can use your IRA as sort of like a private lender if someone or an organization is looking to borrow funds, and then you can earn principal and interest back into the IRA. And another one, actually the last one that's becoming more and more prevalent, is this idea of social investing, impact investing. So a lot of millennials are very passionate about putting their money into causes that hold value to them, whether that's to impact climate change or to help communities grow. There's a lot there in that space that we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of growth potential in that space, and people do have the ability to use their IRAs for those investments as well. So you can see here that the only two things the IRS doesn't allow you to hold in a self-directed account is life insurance and collectibles. So if your category of interest lies outside those two, it's fair game for consideration. So there are a couple different ways to have an investment structured out of a self-directed IRA. For the purposes of today, we're just going to talk about when you're looking at investing into a fund or a private company. So in the case of ADLP, it would be like a series, which would be an LLC, if I'm understanding that correctly. And so how that would work with the self-directed IRA is once you've opened the IRA and funded it with cash, you would either have the ability to use your cash to lend to that entity, or in this case, it would be considered a private placement. So you would purchase, it would be like an equity investment where you'd either be a limited partner or you would purchase units of stock as part of that entity. And then when that pays back, you receive dividends and your investment returns, which you can then either cash out on and you can keep in your IRA. You could take a distribution of that cash out of your IRA, or you can use that cash to reinvest into additional opportunities or back into the same fund. So you have a lot of different options as it goes there, but just keeping in mind that the flow is extremely important so that you're not creating a taxable event. And keep in mind when you're using an IRA as an investment vehicle that anything that leaves the account goes to that investment is reviewed and processed by the custodian, and then any returns on that investment must first come back into the IRA so that they're following the proper reporting channels. And then if at that point you wanted to take funds out and make a withdrawal, you're welcome to do that, but you need to make sure that they go back into the account before anything else. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because the IRS has a list of what they call disqualified persons that your IRA cannot invest directly with, as well as certain types of transactions they consider to be prohibited. So this doesn't usually come up in the case that we're talking about today when you're investing into a fund, because typically if you're doing that with your IRA, you would probably have a minority share in that fund, and you probably wouldn't, you probably wouldn't already be managing it. It would be one that you're sort of removed from, so it'd be more of a passive investment. But there are cases where people do try to use their IRAs to, purchase assets or sell assets to or from certain family members. So you can see here that there's certain family members you're not permitted to do that with. And I won't get into too much detail right now because it's probably for a whole nother webinar to talk about disqualified persons and prohibited transactions. But it is important, I think, if you're kind of new to the idea, to just keep in mind that there are rules that you must follow, and use the custodian as an educational resource to guide you and help make sure that you are aware of the rules and that you're not trying to do something that would be considered prohibited. So these are just some examples of what I mean. If you're investing into a fund or a company that's already owned 50% or more by those disqualified people that were on the prior list, then that's prohibited and you wouldn't be able to do it. If you're investing into a fund, you can't already be an active partner, a managing member, or director of the entity. So as I mentioned already, it kind of has to be more passive in nature. And then those earnings or dividends cannot be paid directly back to you personally. It has to, as I mentioned earlier, first go back to your IRA as a return on your IRA's investment. And then at that point, you would have the ability to decide how you'd like to direct the funds into either a new investment or to make a withdrawal. So the consequences of a prohibited transaction are serious. So you definitely want to make sure that you do your research and you talk to your custodian before you do anything. If a prohibited transaction is identified, the account would be dissolved. So the IRA would basically be distributed to you as if you took a full withdrawal, which means that it would be subject potentially to penalty and any taxes that would have applied. So that can definitely add up to really enormous fees and penalties for you. So you really don't want to create a taxable event like that. So as far as the process, we sort of walked through this, but just to summarize it, and according to the timelines as well, these things are important to know. The first step in order to get an account set up would be completing the application, and you would work with your custodian to do that. They would create a new account with your name and assign you an account number, and then that name and account number of your IRA would be on all the investment documents. So that subscription documents that you would complete, rather than putting your personal name on those, you'd have your name of your IRA as the investor on those. And you would, of course, have the ability to review them, as Brian said, but ultimately the custodian would sign off on those documents on behalf of your IRA. So the second step, once you've opened your account, is funding it. As we had covered, you can make a contribution, you can do a rollover, you could do a transfer. This process just varies so much as far as turnaround times because we have to rely on another institution to send your funds over to us. And depending on their requirements and their processing times, it can really range. So you want to make sure that you're aware of those up front and that we're following all those guidelines as efficiently as possible. And then, of course, the last step is making an investment. And when you choose your desired investment, you should conduct your own due diligence, as we had mentioned at the beginning here, and agree on the terms of your investment. That's not something that the custodian's involved in. But once you've agreed on the terms and you've drafted up the documents for the investment, that's where the custodian comes in to do that sort of compliance review on the documents. So they're looking to see whether this investment is in compliance with IRS guidelines as it relates to IRAs. And then we conduct that review, which can take anywhere from 2 to 5 business days. So you definitely do want to plan ahead if you have an investment in mind to get all this set up and give the custodian time to thoroughly review those documents. And then once that review has been completed, you would basically direct the custodian as well as part of that process as to where you want the funds sent out of your IRA. And your custodian would process that transaction to make sure that the funds are sent to the right entity. And then, of course, the entity would pay back any returns back to your IRA. So they would be sent to the custodian and deposited back into your retirement account. So that's sort of a high level. I'll kind of breeze through that because I know we covered a lot today and we wanted to focus on the debt buying side of things as well. It's definitely not sort of an overnight process to learn about self-directed IRAs. So there's a plethora of information available. If there are any specific investment types you're interested in. If you wanted to have additional conversation, just one-on-one with any of us today, feel free to reach out. And at this point, I'm going to see if we have any questions. Okay, we do have a couple questions. So the first one is, what are the minimum investment required for my IRA into these pools? So I think, Brian, that's a question for you. Do you have a minimum investment that you require into these series?
Sure. The minimum investment is $25,000.
Okay. All right. That's very reasonable. So you don't have to be an accredited investor. You don't have to have, 6 figures in the retirement account, or even if you did have 6 figures and you just wanted to use a portion of your funds, you would have the ability to do that. Okay. So
just to add, taking a say a 3-cent purchase price, around that'll cost $30,000 for the pool. So if you put $25,000 in, you're going to get a little bit less, but close to $1 million in consumer debt. Just to make that comparison in terms of, all right, how much consumer debt would a $25,000 investment get me? I figured, I might as well make that a bit clear.
Sure. Okay, that helps. The next question is just, it's asking whether we're recording this presentation. So if there's, for example, a financial advisor who wants to go back and view and listen again and provide this to their clients or share with their clients, of course, yes, we record every webinar that we do. So as long as you register for the webinar, even if you don't have the opportunity to attend or something comes up last minute, which we understand that happens a lot and it's tough during the workday to get on these things, we record them all and then we follow up with an email to everybody that will provide you a link to access the webinar recording on demand. So anytime you need it, you can refer to that email, and if you ever, for whatever reason, need it again and you've lost the email, you can always just reach out to the office and that can be provided to you. All right, let's see. Do we have any other questions? I think that's it for now. Sometimes I like to just linger a bit and see if anyone else is thinking of any other questions out there that they might be typing in. So we'll just give it a moment. Someone has their hand raised. I don't know if that was intentional to raise your hand, but if you put it down. I'm guessing that it wasn't. But if you were raising your hand to ask a question, please feel free to enter it into the question box. We'll give you a few seconds here if you'd like. Okay, we had a comment. I think it was more so feedback. Good presentation by both entities. That's great. We're glad you found this to be valuable. Thank you for sharing that feedback. Okay, I think at this point that's all the questions we have for now. As we mentioned, of course, we'll have the recording that'll go out within the next day or so, but please feel free to reach out to Brian and or myself with any questions, or if you just feel more comfortable having a one-on-one discussion about anything. There's a lot more information I'm sure we could provide beyond the webinar for today. So with that, Brian, do you have any other closing comments?
No, that's it. I'm set. As you said, we welcome any and all questions. I love talking about this type of material, and I think to get into the real nitty-gritty and granular details of the investment process, what to expect in terms of returns and how those returns can be generated and somewhat predicted, is something that I've taken a great interest in and always happy to discuss further about. So just to reiterate, happy to answer any questions, and hopefully some of the attendees reach out.
Great. All right. Well, thanks again, Brian, for sharing all that with us and being a guest presenter for this month. We appreciate everybody taking the time out of their day to join us, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. Take care.